Today we talk about faction rallies. The most efficient token farm is to simply do lost sectors at 4 renown as fast as possible. 4 renown is the sweet spot for efficiency because you can get it by doing one patrol while simultaneously doing a heroic public event, and coincidentally, you get the biggest extra token bump from 4 renown. Simply repeat this process until your eyeballs explode or you get 1,000 tokens to hit rank 50 with your faction. Quickly address why you don't do other things. Even when the daily bounty is to do strikes or PvP, both of those still earn tokens at a slower rate than just doing lost sectors without the daily bounty, so they're just inefficient. Basically anything that isn't lost sectors is slowing you down if you're trying to get the week's faction rally done, so the only incentive to do those other activities is to break up the monotony. On that note, if you happen to get the daily lost sector bounty, it is actually worth doing. A full set of faction gear gives you 1 extra renown for all renown granting activities, which opens the door to way more ways to get 4 renown efficiently. You can do 1 patrol and a high value target chest, then run into a lost sector, and come back out to the overworld, catch the tail end of a heroic public event, and immediately go do another lost sector. That's about as fast as it gets, but you pretty much never want to miss a heroic public event since that's 5 tokens on its own and immediately gives you enough renown for a lost sector if you've got the armor. Depending on your efficiency, faction rallies will take about 8 to 12 hours to get to rank 50 for the exotic catalyst. That's the quick and easy breakdown of how to get faction rallies done. Now it's time to talk about what could be improved in the future faction rallies following Season 3. First and foremost, I think it was misguided to tie exotic catalysts to factions. I don't think using catalysts as a reward was going to make for a cut and dry winner due to everyone wanting, for instance, the Graviton Lance Masterwork, but I do think it's really lame to tie some of our favorite guns to factions that we may not care for. What if I love Sunshot but want to support New Monarchy? I've always been of the opinion that factions lack meaningful depth, so people's unwavering loyalty to specific factions is pretty arbitrary to me, but the fact does stand, people want to show loyalty to a faction. People have always wanted to connect with Destiny's world however they can, and by tying exotic catalysts to specific factions, we've effectively been discouraged from investing in the faction of our choosing, which reduces whatever connection we may have felt to any given faction. In other words, no matter how much I may like Executor Hideo, if I want the Sunshot Catalyst, I'm going to have to betray my investment in New Monarchy. I don't think that's good. What really drives this point home is that if any player wants to collect all 3 catalysts, that player has to join all 3 factions, definitively showing loyalty to none of them. The new Catalyst reward structure makes the choice of faction feel utterly impersonal, which is a major problem Destiny 2 has faced since its release. I think most players want more unique ways to express themselves and to invest in their characters, which is why we've seen a significant amount of blowback on changes like subclasses moving to the attunements model, static roles replacing one-of-a-kind random roles, and exotic catalysts muddying our decisions of faction loyalty. I think we need to have more outlets to show meaningful individuality in a lot of ways, but tying exotic catalysts to factions basically sets out a clear punishment for continued loyalty to a faction. Loyalty doesn't really have any value in the world of Destiny, I guess. One aspect of this change that's particularly confusing to me is that it actively contradicts the intent behind a change made from Season 2 to Season 3. In Season 2, players could join all 3 factions by joining a different one on each of their characters, but in Season 3, Bungie made factions account-based rather than character-based. I had assumed that the motivation for this change was so that there would be an opportunity cost to choosing any one particular faction, thereby making our choice more significant since we couldn't just pledge loyalty to all 3 as a way of ensuring that we were on the winning side. With this reward system, they've effectively encouraged the exact same behavior, just over a longer period. Granted, we can't guarantee that we'll be getting the reward from the winning faction at a low price now, but the new system still pushes us to play all 3 sides, like before. To me, this seems indicative of a not yet polished approach to faction rewards. How could that problem be addressed? Well, one idea is to just allow us to choose from a selection of catalysts every 50 ranks in our faction, maybe limiting 1 catalyst per faction rally. If every faction offered that selection of catalysts, we would retain our choice of faction loyalty without losing the long-form investment that was clearly intended as part of the new structure. I don't think that's a perfectly elegant solution, but it would at least make the exotic catalysts function as a reward for loyalty rather than the driving component of your faction choice. The general problem being addressed would still be present, though. If we want all of the gear, particularly faction-exclusive weapons, we will have to join all 3 factions. This is a problem Bungie needs to solve. How can players be rewarded for loyalty to a faction of their choosing without making faction loot so exclusive and desirable that it ultimately pushes players to join all 3 factions? In other words, how can Bungie reward players for loyalty without also punishing it? We want faction rewards to be unique and valuable, but we also want faction loyalty to be meaningful. A simple tacked-on fix would be to have every faction sell different gear cosmetically that had the same stats and perk pools. Assuming random rolls have been introduced by the next faction rally, our rewards would still be unique since they would have random rolls, but there would be no external drivers for faction choice other than liking their style. To illustrate what I'm suggesting, I think if all 3 factions had a hand cannon like Dire Promise, it had triple tap, appended mag, the same sights, equal stats across the board, but each of the factions made it look totally different, Dead Orbit being styled as is, New Monarchy putting gold crests on a better Devil's style gun, or Future War Cult having a cutting-edge Amalon variant, then we'd get to choose a faction of our liking without being pushed to a choice by the best weapons. Circling back, this is exactly the problem players seem to have with exotic catalysts, just applied in a broader sense. My impression is it's actually more of a problem outside of catalysts, but since players can circumvent the problem by just joining all 3 factions to get most of what they want with far less effort than 50 ranks, nobody's too worried about how little it contributes to Destiny's world building. In other words, I see it as a design problem that joining all 3 factions is standard practice, but I don't think it's a problem for the general player population since it doesn't adversely affect them relative to other players. For brevity, the system works, but it's not leveraged to much effect. To me, factions seem like a very appropriate place to focus on cosmetics, because unlocking ornament tiers as you climb faction ranks makes for a cool way to show off loyalty but has no punishing consequence for those who don't want to make an effort to be loyal. I think the alternative is that serious players will always join all 3 factions and make the choice irrelevant, which I see as a bad thing. Let's go ahead and move on to the discussion point number 2, the renown mechanic. The more stacks of renown you have, the more damage you take, and the less damage you deal. As long as you have renown at all, your health stops recovering for a long time, and can only be restored by picking up restorative light from killing enemies or other health restoring abilities. Renown is earned by completing patrols, public events, and killing high-value targets, and 1 stack of renown is lost when you die. Also, your movement speed slows when you get to high stacks of renown, and renown caps at 5 stacks. As far as introducing difficulty to content goes, renown is a pretty good mechanic. It's similar to being underleveled with the additional caveat of hindered health regeneration, and you can't fast travel. I think there are only 2 major areas that it falls short in. Firstly, earning stacks of renown is a little sloppy. It can be a problem during Escalation Protocol because completing public event variations of Escalation Protocol waves requires you to do the heroic variant of the event, and suddenly you're at 3 renown and your health doesn't recover, which messes up Escalation Protocol runs. It basically forces you to kill yourself 3 times to continue normally, which is silly. Similarly, if for some reason you wanted to do patrols or public events without renown, renown is going to put the kibosh on that. I do not think earning renown through generic activities was a particularly good fit for making the patrol space more active. I think it would have made better sense to earn renown by killing specific unique world bosses that appear during faction rallies, at least as far as patrol spaces are concerned. A simpler solution would be to have an equipped class item or emblem be a way to opt into earning renown, which would prevent us from getting it unavoidably by just doing general play stuff. I think this should be addressed because having our health recovery taken away due to renown when we aren't actively trying to earn renown is pretty inconvenient in a hard to ignore way that, again, does feel sloppy. The second problem I think renown has is that it should not be lost when you're opening a lost sector cache. I think using it as a mechanic that makes the game harder and disallows fast travel is pretty cool, but in gameplay, I think it would be better if we were able to keep and continue to build our renown. If renown wasn't taken away through redemption, we would have a somewhat shorter grind. Renown's effects would be less off and on, so they would feel like they have a more obvious gameplay impact, and we would have a permanent way of showing our faction's aura on our back. As long as we're able to opt out of earning renown by not equipping the emblem or class item, keeping our renown would make Faction Rally feel more like an event and less like a convoluted action that you repeat 300 times. To put that more clearly, I think the current iteration of renown basically has us do a patrol and public event, followed by a lost sector, and then just repeat that over and over again, basically disappearing out of the overworld that you want to see more active during an event. It's very tedious, and letting us keep our renown seems like a reasonable first step in diversifying that tedium. Just in case it isn't clear though, I do think renown is a good mechanic. It could be applied to strikes by giving you 5 renown at the beginning, allowing you to earn bonus tokens for the strike unless you die 5 or more times, where you get only the baseline amount, and you could even do a similar approach that could be applied to raids or maybe even PvP. The only major thing is that renown should have a way to opt in or out, but finding ways to integrate it more broadly would be fantastic. It is a good mechanic. And this is a great segue into discussion point number 3, which is the single most unenjoyable part about Season 3's faction rallies for me is the implementation of lost sectors. Lost sectors, while visually interesting, are mechanically dull. Most lost sectors are as straightforward as kill some red bars and then kill a yellow bar. Some have very light mechanics, but they all feel samey as a result of that consistent structure. Implementing lost sectors as part of faction rallies is understandable since it gives them a purpose, but quite honestly, lost sectors just aren't interesting enough that they should have been given any reason to do them hundreds of times. I think they should have been made more interesting first and then implemented for faction rallies afterwards. It feels like a case of putting the cart before the horse. Because the cart was put before the horse, faction rallies feel repetitive and demanding in an unpleasant way. It causes more fear of missing out on loot than encouragement to have any fun at all with Destiny gameplay. In plain terms, what has happened here with faction rallies is we have lost sectors, they're boring and there's no reason to do them, and then faction rallies come along and now we suddenly have a reason to do lost sectors, but they're still boring. Combine that with the fact that it's clearly the most efficient farm, and you had to grind 1,000 tokens for rank 50 for an exotic catalyst, and you've subjected the player base doing faction rallies to a boring grind that is also tedious. Combine that with the fact that the faction rallies are an event rather than being available all the time, and you've deprived players of the choice to play activities of their choosing at their own pace if they want the catalysts. All said and done, the current implementation of faction rallies pushes players to complete hours and hours of unfun content within the unforgiving span of a week. Is that the faction rally's fault or the renown mechanic's fault? Not really, but lost sectors need to be a lot more interesting if we're going to be bribed to do them. The bottom line is that I think it was a mistake to push us to uninteresting content without polishing it to make it interesting first. Rewards can't fix that on their own. As far as the end goal of factions is concerned, hitting rank 50 isn't really asking for too much, but it does become a problem when the best way to rank up doesn't leverage any of what makes the game fun. Strikes would have made a lot more sense to use than lost sectors as a baseline activity for better diversity in environments and more engaging difficulty, and, boss variety. Additionally, most of the loot that you get from ranking up is repetitive, starting at around rank 25 or 30 because of static rolls, so you wind up dismantling almost all of the rewards you get on the road to rank 50 for a catalyst. With the current design, I do not think that faction rallies are very fun or rewarding, but it's still got exclusive loot, so a lot of players are going to feel like they have to endure those problems with its design. Destiny has great gameplay, it's really polished. I don't think there's much of an excuse for grinds not to be fun to do. I just don't think that most of what makes Destiny good is being capitalized on here. If players want to play strikes or PvP or raid or patrols, they shouldn't be punished by having their reputation gains throttled since they aren't doing lost sectors. Unless faction rallies bring an entirely new activity in the future, I don't think any specific activity that's already part of the game should be the most efficient farm. It's one thing to encourage players to do new content, but lost sectors aren't new. We would already be doing them if we thought they were where we would have the most fun. The promise of good rewards doesn't make uninteresting content more fun, it just makes us have to do it. It's more like a job than a game at that point. So, at this point, I've talked about exotic catalysts and rewards, I've talked about the new renown mechanic, and I've talked about the integration of lost sectors into faction rallies. These are the three major aspects of faction rallies that I really feel are worth talking about, but I'm going to go over a couple other details before I wrap this up. Everything considered, I do understand that events are a balancing act. The faction rallies event needs to encourage gameplay we don't always normally do, or it wouldn't feel like an event, and accordingly, it has to have exclusive rewards only available for a week at a time. However, that most certainly does cause a problem for people without tons of time to play the game, because grinding 10 hours for an exotic catalyst over a single week doing a not very fun grind is just extremely unappealing. They don't want to play a dozen hours a week in the first place, let alone doing a specific activity they don't find very fun, but if they don't do lost sectors, they probably won't get the reward, and even if they do run lost sectors, they might not get the catalyst if they don't dedicate a ton of time to it. Honestly, that whole aspect of it just sucks. Forcing us to concentrate an unfun grind into a week is just bad for players who aren't prepared to do it, and it's unfun even for the players who are willing and able. My opinion is that it is unavoidable that events need to focus on highly rewarding, casual-friendly activities, and base gameplay is where grinds for things like Iron Banner and faction rallies actually make sense. Events should allow any kind of player to leave feeling glad they took the time out of their day to participate in the event. I don't necessarily think Destiny 1's universally available factions was far better, but there needs to be mindful consideration to what designs will motivate players through fear of missing out, and what designs will motivate players by giving them a carrot to chase. The current way that faction rallies are set up feels like Destiny 1's faction reward structure condensed into 1 week increments. It seems to amp up the demandingness into that 1 week interval without a worthwhile payoff that is, amped up in response. Also, Having the faction armor sets contribute so much to making progress with the faction, but giving it to players on a totally random reward basis for ranking up isn't really okay. It isn't fair to tie something closely to progression while locking it behind randomness, particularly in something that only lasts a week, so you need to be as efficient as possible. I really think we should have some guaranteed means of getting the armor set as the only way to acquire it. Armor sets that don't tie to progress should be random, but faction armor ties to progress, so it needs to have a specific clear path to getting it. That's about all I have to say about these for now. To quickly summarize everything that I've said over the course of this video, I think that loyalty to a faction should earn us better rewards by far than joining all three factions in every way from catalysts to armor and weapons. I think that earning and losing renown should be looked at for minor tweaks to enable players to do what they'd like to do during faction rallies, unless we get an entirely new game mode for the duration of the event. And I think that lost sectors should not be emphasized until they're more rewarding from a gameplay perspective without loot as a factor. I have two questions that drove the discussion in this video that I would like to see Bungie tackling in the future, and they are: how can loyalty to a single faction be rewarded substantially enough that players don't feel like they are making concessions by not joining all three factions? And how should factions enhance the game experience in their new week-long event structure? Thanks for watching. Follow my Twitch.